Welcome back to Shadowy Stories. I've been retired for almost 8 years. No, wait, years, God. Time flies. I have to say, I have mixed feelings about retirement. On one hand, I'm glad to have more time to spend with my wife, Linda, and the kids after a lifetime of working. It's good to finally relax and enjoy life. We've taken vacations, spent quality time together, and had the chance to see the world. On the other hand, I get bored easily. I've always been a bizboy. I spent my younger years as a fisherman, braving the open sea. Later, as I got older, I transitioned into a career as a marine surveyor, inspecting ships to ensure they met safety standards, and, when necessary, investigating maritime incidents. It sounds morbid, I know, but I loved the work. I loved piecing together the puzzle, unraveling the mystery, the investigations, the reports. The whole process was far more complex than it sounds. I could spend hours discussing the intricacies, but I'll spare you the details for now. Most of the incidents I investigated were fairly mundane, usually mechanical failures or human error sometimes, though there were casualties, ships sinking, that sort of thing. Whatever the case, I'd go through the motions, file my report, and let the authorities handle the rest. In my 15 years as a surveyor, many cases stuck with me, but the one that haunts me the most, the one I can't shake, is the last case of my career, the sinking of the Poseidon. 8 years. And I still can't find a rational explanation. Linda tells me to let it go, but it's not that easy. I've never told her the full story technically. I'm not supposed to divulge it now either. But tonight, after a few drinks, I've decided to break my silence. Maybe, just maybe, speaking about it will help me see something I missed. Maybe the answer has been staring me in the face all along. The Poseidon was a refrigerated cargo ship en route from South Africa to Montreal, carrying perishable goods. It was due to arrive in Montreal on February 7, 2015. It never made it. The last communication with the Poseidon was 3 days prior. That's when people on shore started to worry. The Poseidon was an older vessel, and it had experienced technical difficulties in the past. What's more, a blizzard was hitting the region, and the St. Lawrence River was thick with ice. At first, they thought the Poseidon was simply delayed by the storm. Radio communication can be unreliable, however. When the Poseidon still hadn't shown up by February 8, real concern set in. Search and rescue teams scoured the St. Lawrence, but found nothing. Eventually they located the Poseidon, or what was left of it, in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. I still remember the shock of seeing the photographs of the wreckage. The bow and part of the upper deck were exposed, the rest almost entirely encased in ice. I had never seen anything like it. Rescue efforts were launched, but it was clear from the air that there were no signs of life. On the upper deck, they found several bodies, partially scavenged by birds. Cause of death was hard to determine. The cargo hold appeared to have been ravaged by some sort of explosion. Most of the cargo was incinerated, like something you'd see with thermite or white phosphorus. But there wasn't any identifiable residue left behind. Below deck, the rescue teams discovered more bodies, relatively well preserved. Some were even clutching weapons. They theorized that the crew had engaged in some kind of conflict, but the identity of their attackers remained unknown. The crew members all suffered severe burns, but no other apparent injuries. We spent half a day investigating the ship, but found nothing conclusive. There was only one survivor, Eric Harper. He had been trapped in the galley. The door jammed shut and sealed with ice. If the rescue team hadn't heard a noise, they might have missed him entirely. It took them over an hour to chisel through the ice. When they finally broke through, Harper stabbed one of the rescuers in the shoulder with a knife. He lashed out like a cornered animal, hysterical, until he realized they were rescuers. In early March 2015, I was assigned to speak with Harper. By then, the wreckage of the Poseidon had been towed to the nearest port for examination. Harper remained silent. My team and I decided to investigate the hull first. The thick layer of ice on the ship made the investigation extremely difficult. The ship was frozen inside and out, and the lower decks were flooded and frozen solid. We used ground-penetrating radar and sonar to pinpoint a breach in the hull, and then used mining equipment to break through the ice. Initially, We thought the breach was caused by a collision, but the markings on the hull were inconsistent with collision damage and looked like something had melted a section of the hull. Whatever it was, it had left a hole large enough for a grown man to stand in. The fire on board was equally perplexing. With no answers on the ship itself, we turned to Harper. He still wasn't talking when I arrived at the office in Gatineau, Quebec to interview him. He was in his 40s, bald. With a stern face and narrow eyes, he had a Maori tat on one arm. He looked incredibly tense, like a tightly wound spring. "Eric, it's good to meet you," I said, sitting down. He just stared at me, silent. "My name is Thomas. How are you feeling today?" "All right," he replied flatly. At least he was responding. A sign he was willing to communicate. "Are you settled in? Have you contacted your family?" I asked. "They're in town. My wife's waiting for me at the hotel." "Good. It's important to have their support, Eric. We need to talk about what happened on the Poseid. And do you remember anything?" Silence. He looked away. His breathing heavy. He closed his eyes, then opened them again. "Eric, if you don't want to talk today, you don't have to. We can wait until you're ready," I said. "I just need to understand what happened." "You've seen the ship, haven't you?" Harper finally spoke. "Isn't that enough?" "Yes, the ship tells a story, but we're still confused." Another silence. He looked at me again, his expression softening slightly. "Where do you want me to begin?" he asked. "Just tell me what you remember." Harper nodded slowly. I guess I should start with what we saw out in the Atlantic," he said. "About 8 days out of Cape Town, or rather. That's when I first heard about it. I didn't see it at first. I heard about it from the others. At night, they saw something on the water." "Saw what?" "Lights, reflections in the sky. At first we thought they were planes, but there were too many of them. We knew something wasn't right. Like I said, I didn't see them at first, just heard about it." "You saw them later, right?" Harper nodded. "Just once late at night. I was outside having a smoke, and I saw them fly past the port side lip planes at first glance, but they were flying too low. Too fast. 1 minute they were there, the next they were gone, vanished into the clouds. I didn't think much of it at the time, just thought it was odd, figured it was some new kind of aircraft. I brushed it off. But I know some of the guys on board thought it was creepy. They thought we were being followed. Some even said we had something special in the cargo hold and that someone had sent spy planes to monitor us. I thought that was ridiculous. They were just jumpy, making up stories because they saw some strange planes. Then they noticed some odd crates in the cargo hold and started speculating wildly." "Odd crates in the cargo hold?" "Yeah, some kind of lab samples, I think. I was there during loading. We were told to handle them with care. I don't know what was in them, but I figured the captain did. We stored them separately from the food. To prevent cross-contamination, we carried unusual cargo from time to time, so I didn't think much of it." "So, up until February 5th, you were sailing according to schedule, right?" "Yes." He paused. "Can you tell me what happened on February 5th? He fell silent, closing his eyes again. I encouraged him to take his time. "We hit a storm out at sea," he said. "We knew it was coming, but it hit us faster and harder than we expected. We were battening down the hatches, getting everything secured when we saw the lights again. Far off in the distance this time. Some of the guys were still worried, but we were just focused on getting the hatches sealed before the storm hit us properly. My team finished up, and we headed down to the mess hall for dinner. I didn't see what happened on deck. We just sat down when the ship lurched violently, like we'd been hit by something. A crewman ran in, yelling that the lower decks were breached and we needed to help. We hadn't even made it out of the mess hall when the engines cut out. The ship lurched again, and I nearly fell." "You don't know what caused the engine failure?" Harper shook his head. "No, all I know is there was a hole in the ship. A big one. By the time we got down there, the flooding was bad. Guys were pulling people out of the water. Others were trying to plug the breach. Then the water froze." "Froze?" Harper nodded. "I don't know how else to describe it. 1 minute, water was pouring in. The next it was ice. Some of the guys were trapped in the corridor, water up to their knees. They didn't have time to get out, they were frozen in the ice, struggling, some broke free. But most were Rapsack. The foreman told me to get help. Another guy and I ran to the bridge to radio for help. But before we could contact the mainland, things got worse. What happened? Honestly, I don't know. Harper replied, we heard over the intercom that someone had boarded the ship. But they were cut off mid-sentence at first. We thought it was the storm knocking out the power, but then we made our way to the upper deck. And I heard gunshots, screaming, and a smell. He sighed, rubbing his face. God, I don't know how to describe it, he mumbled. Burning. I mean, my crew, they were being burned alive. You're saying someone set them on fire? Yes, I think so. The guy with me wanted to see what was happening, but I knew from the smell that going up there was suicide. I tried to warn him, but he wouldn't listen. I went to the galley, grabbed a knife, and locked the door. Figured I could at least hide if they found me. I'd fight. I listened intently, committing every word to memory. His voice trembled, and his eyes darted around, as if he were reliving that horrific night. He continued. After a while, the ship went quiet. The air was cold, colder than I'd ever felt. I could hear movement on the deck, but no more fighting. Then I heard footsteps in the corridor. They started opening doors. I figured they were searching for survivors, and they found them. I heard other crew members screaming, and then these gunshot-like sounds, but it wasn't like any gunshot I'd ever heard. More of a crackling, sizzling sound, and the burning smell intensified whenever they fired. Finally, they came to my door. I thought about barricading it, but I was afraid that would just make them force their way in, so I just closed the door and hid. The door opened, and I gripped the knife, seeing a figure step inside. It was dark in the galley, so I couldn't see much at first, but as the door opened wider, light from outside spilled in, and I got a good look. It wasn't tall, maybe 5 feet, wearing some kind of protective suit. The helmet was reflective. I could see reflections of things around it. It was holding some kind of gun. Don T asked me what kind of gun. I was too scared to focus on it. All I remember clearly is the sound of my own blood rushing in my skull. It stepped inside, pulled out something that looked like a scanner, and started sweeping it from left to right. I knew I was caught. It was about to turn towards me, so I lunged. I grabbed its gun arm, pulled it towards me, and I heard the gunshot, the same sizzling sound I'd heard before. I felt a searing heat on my left side, and a couple of dishcloths on the counter next to me burst into flames, but there was no projectile, no flame where the gun just seemed to explore. Generate heat. It struggled, but it wasn't strong. I stabbed it in the chest with the knife, but it didn't scream, didn't even make a sound. It didn't stop struggling either. I grabbed a chain that was nearby, wrapped it around my hand, used one hand to restrain it, and the other to loop the chain over its helmet. I was trying to choke it, or tie it up that S, when it broke free with one hand and pulled something that looked like pen out of its suit and touched it to my side. I felt this massive jolt, and I went flying, crashing into the freezer. I couldn't even scream. The pain was so intense, but the chain was still wrapped around its head, and the force of the impact pulled it with me. Its faceplate smashed against the corner of a table, cracking the helmet. It twitched a couple of times, then went limp. I think I dislocated my wrist and definitely cracked a rib, but I got up that S when I saw its face. What did it look like? Eric continued. It had multiple eyes, large, black, shiny eyes, a small nose, a small mouth. Most of its face was just eyes. I couldn't see any expression, or I couldn't recognize any expression. Its skin seemed blue. I can't quite remember, but it definitely wasn't normal human skin. It looked dead. I stared at its empty eyes, stabbed it a few more times. Honestly, I wasn't even sure it could die. The gun had fallen from its hand, so I picked it up. I saw two more figures in the corridor, also in the suits. One of them pointed its gun at me, so I pulled the trigger on the one I'd taken and started firing. Like I said, it didn't shoot anything. No recoil, no muzzle flash, just he like standing next to a bonfire. Only much more intense. It worked, though. They didn't burn, but it pushed them back. One of them tried to fire back, but then the ship lurched violently. There were explosions, fire everywhere outside in the corridor. and they ran for a second. I thought about going after them, but I wasn't that crazy. They were gone, and I ran to the door and closed it. A few minutes later, I felt the ship sinking. The thing I'd stabbed in the galley, it started to combust. The suit seemed to catch fire first, and then it spread to the body. It freaked me out. The gun started getting hot too. I dropped it, and it also burned the body, and the gun burned fast, less than a minute, and there was nothing left but some scorch marks. Even though they seemed to be gone, I was still terrified. I huddled in a corner with my knife shaking, imagining they might come back. The radio was useless. The power never came back on, but the food stores in the galley kept me alive. I see, I said quietly. You attacked the rescue team when they found you, didn't you? I thought those things had come back, he said. I panicked when I realized what I'd done. His voice trailed off. I was in that room for 3 days, freezing, burning. If you hadn't come, I would have used the knife on myself. Look, I don't mean to be insensitive, but your story sounds a little... I trailed off. You don't believe me? Harper's face darkened. I believe you, I said. But like you said, you weren't in a good state of mind when they pulled you out. You might be misremembering some details. The beings you saw, they don't sound human. They weren't human. Harper's voice rose. You don't understand. The material of those aircraft was strange. I saw other crew members' bodies on my way out, burned to a crisp. I saw what those guns could do. Check the galley. You'll find the scorch marks. I know you think I'm crazy, but I know what I saw. Whatever attacked us that day, it wasn't human. When I stared into the eyes of that thing, all those eyes, I felt it red. I can't explain. You have to keep investigating. I'm not lying. A few days later, I returned to the Poseidon, focusing on the galley and the mess hall. I found the scorch marks Harper had described. My colleagues took samples and sent them to the lab. I'm convinced the lab found something, but my team and I were pulled off the investigation. My superiors said been handed over to another department. They wouldn't elaborate. We were made to sign NDAs and told that if anyone asked about the Poseidon, we were to say it's ain't nothing more. Less than a year later, I retired, partly due to my age, partly to try and forget about the Poseidon. It hasn't worked. For 8 years I haven't slept well. I replay the evidence. I replay my conversation with Eric Harper. I'm sure I recorded every word accurately. I try to find a rational way to explain it all, but it just doesn't add up. I can't imagine any weapon that could melt through a ship's hull like that, or any way to freeze the water on the ship so quickly. 8 years, and I haven't encountered anything even remotely similar. Nothing on this earth could have inflicted the damage we saw on the Poseidon. I keep coming back to Harper's description of those things, his conviction that they weren't human from the way he described it. I don't think he was lying. If nothing on Earth could have launched such an attack, then maybe whatever attacked the Poseidon was from Earth. Am I old? Am I losing my mind? Am I misremembering something? It's the only conclusion I can draw. And if that's true, will they be back someday? Or maybe I am just crazy. God, I hope I'm just crazy.